Chapter 3. Economic Degrees of Freedom. To understand a system and its constraints, it is often helpful to identify degrees of freedom to see what possibilities exist within the system. For instance, a train has 1 degree of freedom. It can move forwards or backwards. A car has 2 degrees of freedoms. It can move forwards, backwards, left, or right. However, when 1 degree of freedom has been hidden, it can be difficult to identify it. For instance, if all cars were sold with a locked steering wheel, cars would only go forward or backward. Soon this restricted behavior would become normal. Roads would be designed to make driving without turning the wheels easier. The purpose of the steering wheel would be forgotten. First, it would be turned into a clothes hanger, like much home exercise equipment. In later models, it might be eliminated altogether. A society that worships conformity has 0 apparent degrees of freedom. This may be hard to understand in a consumer society which prides itself on choice. However, while the choices are abundant, they're restricted to a fairly narrow range. Consider shaving kits for men. These are restricted to various multi-bladed safety razors, in which a below-cost handle locks the consumer into a product line, after which more expensive replacement blades can be sold to recover the cost. It's getting increasingly hard to find the old flat single safety razor blades that can be sharpened. A straight razor can only be bought from barbershops, hairdressers, or specialized shops on the internet. Not shaving at all is sure to make a person stand out. Thus, this is an example where the degrees of freedom for the consumer have been eliminated. It also shows the possibility of finding other solutions. In democratic societies with the free market, and certain other societies as well, the economic possibilities of a member of society can be described with at least 2 degrees of freedom. This domain of economic behaviors is divided into 4 quadrants, existing on 2 axes, with the y-axis describing the linearity of the person's activities, and the x-axis describing the coupling between the person and the activities, typically through an economic system. Coupling is a measure of a person's dependence on the world. In principle, it also measures the world's dependence on the individual. However, except for billionaires, leaders of totalitarian countries, and rock stars, it's doubtful how much impact individual people have on the world. A tight coupling means that one part depends strongly on another part of the system. For instance, the front wheels of a car are tightly coupled to the steering wheel, which is good. When the steering wheel turns, the front wheels turn as well. For a consumer, food and shelter are tightly coupled to a paycheck, which is not good. Much effort and engineering goes into establishing tight couplings between some parts. For example, the steering system mentioned earlier, and removing couplings between other parts, for example, not having the steering system coupled to the engine system. A tight coupling or a complete lack of coupling makes the response predictable. This is also useful in social engineering. For instance, a consumer that is fully dependent on a paycheck is more likely to stay employed and not quit his job. Hence, employers can make the supply of labor more predictable by only offering full-time jobs, which makes employees unlikely to go home early, and tying in generous benefits, which makes employees unlikely to quit. A loosely coupled system is less likely to fail. Loosely coupled systems have slack. They're flexible and resilient. This means that they function within a range of parameters rather than just at a single value. While slack in the steering of a car is not preferred, it is preferred, for example, in large organizations where tight couplings can lead to bottlenecks if there is only one person in charge of approving a specific form. Personal finance is another area where loose couplings are desired. For instance, a person who bought less house than he could afford is less likely to lose his home if his income drops or the cost of living increases. It naturally follows that slack or loose couplings have a cost, in that they're less efficient under normal operations. Conversely, they're less costly under disrupted operations, such as in catastrophes. Changing the tightness or looseness of a coupling is therefore a way of adjusting risk versus profit. Here, risk is defined as uncertainty rather than loss. Linearity is different from coupling. The opposite of linear is nonlinear. In general, nonlinear processes and activities have feedbacks which influence the process itself, changing it, while linear processes lack feedback. For example, consider a worker who is able to produce 2 unrelated widgets, A and B. If producing twice as many A widgets requires twice as much work, and if the production of A widgets does not influence or depend on the production of B widgets in any way, the widget production is linear. When activities are linear, the result from adding activities or from increasing the effort is very predictable. Work can be very complicated but still be linear. Surgery, for example, is linear. Twice as many surgeries take twice as many resources, and performing brain surgery on patient A is not going to speed up or influence the operation on patient B. The output is clearly defined by the input. Nonlinear activities have a less than clear relationship between input and output. This is because part of the output also acts as input. This part of input becomes new output, which again goes back and influences the system all over again. Unlike the simple arrangement of a linear organization, a nonlinear organization can be very sophisticated. Consider a business which sells widgets A and B. It can distribute money between production, product development, and advertising. If widget A is advertised, it will influence the sales of both widgets A and B through brand name association, but decrease product development and possibly production. Yet if sales increase, it will allow economy of scale savings on the production. Estimating the output based on the input is difficult. The best general example of linearity is assembly work. Linear assembly work turns specific inputs into specific outputs, always. The inputs are the assembly worker's time and energy, and some components from another assembly worker. These inputs are added together to form other components, which are handed over to the next assembly worker. While the assembly worker's job itself may be very involved and require many skills, the process is still linear. An outside observer can count on the fact that, given twice as much time and energy, the assembly worker can construct twice as many predictably identical components. Contrast this with the nonlinear work of an entrepreneur, a scientist, or a football coach. In a nonlinear problem, the whole is different from the sum of the components. What makes the whole different is the structure connecting the parts. For the assembly line, the structure is the assembly line, or conveyor belt itself. For a car, the structure is what makes the individual parts of a car. In football, the structure of the plays is sometimes more important than individual players. Nonlinearity is inherently much harder to deal with than linearity. In fact, a tremendous amount of effort goes into linearizing problems to make them understandable and solvable. There are several methods to linearize a problem. The first method is to reduce the degrees of freedom by reducing the number of objects and the number of connections between the objects, thus making the problem easier to understand. This simplifies the problem, but it runs the risk of eliminating degrees of freedom that are essential to the problem. The solution to the simplified problem is not necessarily the solution to the original problem. Furthermore, the simpler problem does not show the richness of solutions of the original problem. This method of simplification is probably the greatest source of error and inaccuracy, particularly because the answers to simple problems are generally precise, but let's not mistake precision for accuracy. The second method is to break big problems into smaller problems in a reductionist way. Each sub-problem can then be tackled linearly. If not, it is further broken down. Once the sub-problems have been solved, the solution to the big problem is found by adding the sub-solutions together. Unfortunately, this doesn't always produce the optimal solution. For instance, one can't bake a loaf of bread by first heating the flour for half an hour, then heating the milk or water for half an hour, then heating the yeast for half an hour, and then mixing them all together at the end. Baking requires complex interactions between the flour, the yeast, and the liquid prior to baking for the optimal solution. It's not trivial to find this solution. Unfortunately, we haven't found a mechanical method to find optimal, clever, or as mathematicians would say, elegant solutions to complex problems. Such solutions often rely on intuitive insights. Intuition is a result of complex neural connections in the brain suddenly firing in a way that connects with real problems. This requires two ingredients. The first ingredient is the network itself, which can be established by studying many other similar problems. The second ingredient is thinking about the problem at hand. Combining the experience of similar solutions with the current problem results in new and creative solutions, often accompanied by statements such as, "I was contemplating something when I suddenly was inspired by something unrelated." For instance, Alfred Wegener, the discoverer of plate tectonics, the theory that explains the motion of land masses, allegedly was inspired by looking at the collision of pack flows while camping on the ice. Until such a method is found, there's likely an upper limit to the level of complexity humans can handle. On the other hand, it's my opinion that adaptation and complexity are exactly what make us human. Compared to other animals, there's always some other animal that is either faster, taller, bigger, stronger, or better looking. However, there are no animals that beat us in the decathlon of life. And this is why humans are at the top of the food chain. Adapting to complex situations makes it possible to substantially increase the level of resources and the number of possible solutions. It's like having a toolbox instead of a hammer when it comes to problem solving. 3.1. Economic classifications. The 2 degrees of freedom, linearity, and coupling describe 4 different types of person. I call these the salaryman, linear and tightly coupled, the working man, linear and loosely coupled, the businessman, nonlinear and tightly coupled, and the Renaissance man, nonlinear and loosely coupled. In most cases, a person will identify with aspects of all 4, yet a person's behavioral habits from one type tend to dominate those of the other 3, allowing us to classify any person as one of 4 types. The totality of all people forms an ecosystem or a culture of 4 interdependent types of differently behaving and differently thinking kinds of humans. Each type of human tends to fill a different niche of society. In different periods, different types will dominate the culture. The non-dominant types will be considered undesirable or unrealistic, whereas the dominant type will generally be considered the right way of doing things, and soon the way we have always done it. People of the dominant type effectively characterize the culture and will justify their actions by saying, everybody likes to such and such, or all normal people like to do it this way. Those living differently will be questioned. What would happen to the present institutions of society if everybody started behaving like you do? For example, the alarmed economist questions what would happen to the economy if everybody stopped consuming and started living on a quarter of what they used to. The answer is simple. The economy would be different. Some institutions would vanish and others would form. 3.1.1. The Salaryman. Most salarymen are specialized wage earners who earn money from one source only. Often they have no control over the source of the money. For instance, they can choose between having a full-time job or having no job at all. This scarcity creates competition for full-time jobs, rather than a continuous and less competitive distribution of effort between all wage earners. The jobs which specialists are typically hired for comprise a fairly narrow set of tasks. Their job is to use certain resources and turn them into certain parts of a final product. Thus, salarymen have little control beyond their well-defined job descriptions. Salarymen have options, but they do not create options. This linearization makes them predictable and subject to indirect control. This control is exerted by providing a choice within a narrow range. For example, you can choose between the following 3 models of cookie-cutter homes. You shouldn't modify them or your resale value will be impaired. You can choose to drive a car subject to various rules and regulations. You can choose between the following 2 political candidates. You shouldn't vote for others or your vote will be wasted. You can choose between the following 25 different heavily advertised breakfast cereals, but don't think of starting your day with anything but breakfast cereal. You can choose the size and type of your TV and the number of channels, but don't consider not watching TV or you might miss out. These examples give the illusion of freedom while retaining control. With both work and consumption being well controlled, the salaryman may be thought of as a brick in a wall or a cog in a machine. The associated cash flows are relatively simple. In the simplest case, time and energy flows from the specialist into a wage-earning job. Money from the job, in turn, covers 100% of expenses. Thus, the professional puts time and energy into his work that pays him a wage income, which is used to pay for stuff that he subsequently consumes. Wages are typically preset to be economic, meaning that there is no profit nor loss in it for the professional. The profit and loss in this setup goes to the owner of the machine that the cog fits into. It's obvious that the professional in this case is tightly coupled to his job. Many people's budgets are tightly coupled since they've been encouraged to spend everything they earn. Why work if you can't spend your paycheck? After all, you deserve it. You earned it. In fact, many financial planners implicitly assume expenses equal income in their calculations. Therefore, any decrease in income is felt instantly. An industrial example of a tightly coupled linear system is a manufacturing plant. If any part of the system runs slow, the entire plant runs slow and output decreases. The incentive is, therefore, to make sure that all parts are equally fast or equally slow and work together as a team. Most consumer products are also engineered as tightly coupled linear products. For those products, it's optimal if all parts have about the same rate of failure. If one component lasts a lot longer and the product isn't designed to be repaired, that component is deemed to be over-engineered, and it will be replaced by a cheaper component which would create more profit. Thus, if a product hasn't been designed to be repaired, which is the case for most consumer products, one will experience the curious phenomenon that once one part fails and is repaired, other parts will start failing soon after. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to state that many consumers' budgets work in a similar manner. The earlier example demonstrates the typical cash flow of people without credit. People with access to credit can go into debt, and they usually do. In this case, debt can be used to pay for more stuff, and wages can be used to pay for debt, such as from credit cards, car loans, mortgages, student loans, and so on. This allows people to buy more than they can presently afford in exchange for less income in the future. Few people pay cash anymore, and financial success depends on being good at managing debt. As an ironic twist, like grade point averages in school, debt management skills are also evaluated in a single number, called a credit score. It's not clear exactly how a credit score is computed, and therefore much time is spent trying to outguess the system. Personal finance, as opposed to business finance, operates on the concept of consumption smoothing, also known as fake it until you make it, as it allows consumers to buy products which they presently can't afford due to lack of savings, but will be able to afford by making payments over time. Unlike a business which invests the money in assets with a higher return, allowing businesses to use debt as a leverage, consumers invest in higher consumption. The lack of return on assets to pay the interest means they must either work harder or longer for their consumption, and so they do. Add lifestyle inflation, and you have a process that inherently demands more and more work, while quite possibly providing less and less contentment. This is the definition of a wage slave. Wage slaves are free to change their job, but they're not free to quit their job. Wage slaves are free to choose other products as long as they can afford it, but they're not capable of creating alternatives to buying products because they're too busy working. 3.1.2. The Working Man. A working man is someone who doesn't collect a salary or other associated benefits. His income is uncertain, possibly because he takes on smaller projects that only last days, weeks, or perhaps months, and he knows and plans for this. It's likely he does some form of freelance consulting or works for multiple employers in short order, one at a time. A working man should therefore not have a tightly coupled budget like the salaryman, as job loss can result in homelessness or the inability to purchase products. Therefore, the working man often establishes an emergency fund to introduce some slack into the system, which allows him to continue consuming during periods with less or no income. This fund covers the budget, at least temporarily, if the money flow is reduced or cut off. An alternative is to purchase unemployment insurance. A similar alternative is to use credit cards. However, with sporadic income, credit will be more expensive for the working man compared to the salaryman who earns a steadier income. The purpose of an emergency fund or unemployment insurance is to cover unexpected expenses or lack of income for the amount of time it takes to find another job. An industrial example of a loosely coupled linear system is a mining operation, where miners carry their own rebreathers. Normally, a mine functions like an assembly line. But if one link fails, which would be catastrophic if everybody was hooked up to the same line of oxygen, it doesn't impact the entire line catastrophically. Mining operations are loosely coupled for precisely this reason. The principal financial difference between a salaryman and a working man, as defined here, is the amount of fiscal coupling. The salaryman has easy access to credit, and if he chooses to accept this burden, he must maintain a job to shoulder it. A working man will also often, but not always, have easy access to credit. This means, as mentioned earlier, that the working man must maintain a financial buffer to create slack in the system. Although lately salarymen have realized the virtues of creating a buffer between their salaries and their obligations, as layoffs have become more common as well. The lack of easy credit also means fewer obligations. Working men are closer to a situation where they can decouple themselves from a particular job or career. In fact, working men tend to have a much easier time finding jobs than professional specialists. The latter must go to where the jobs are, which can often result in steep costs of living, whereas less specialized jobs can be found everywhere. If the working man puts some effort into job searching, he should be able to move through a succession of employment contracts. While the lack of a steady paycheck may seem risky, it's actually safer, as the working man has been conditioned to the situation of having to find new jobs. He actually thinks of them as clients rather than employers, and thus considers it normal. A salaryman is rarely without a job, but when he is, it's a high-stress event, almost like a death in the family. Still, the consumer pattern of a working man is similar to that of the salaryman. As working men generally earn less, there's a drive — you only need to watch a commercial from your local college to see how this works — from the working class to the salaried class, as the latter is able to spend more and hence is perceived to live a better life. The public perception of a link between cost of living and quality of life is strong. 3.1.3 The Businessman. The difference between the businessman and the working man, or the salaryman, is that the cash flow, which is directly associated with the personal consumption of the businessman, is just a fraction of the total business cash flow he controls. The money under control is typically retained earnings from operations, paid in capital, or simply borrowed from other investors. Hence, the businessman sets up a business by using a combination of his own and other people's savings, that is, other people's money, OPM. This business may take many forms, from owning a rental home to sole proprietorships and partnerships to corporations of various sizes. A business generates cash flow by converting assets into income. The businessman inserts himself into this cash flow. By being in control of more than just his own time and energy, he controls more cash flow and thus earns more. Some businessmen create jobs by putting together assets and resources in a structure that is profitable, making it possible for workers to earn a wage. This combination creates a solution to a problem in the form of a product that can be sold. The problems are typically those of consumers who buy the businessman's products, but they could also be problems related to government, military, or other business operations. The cycle has thus come full circle. The salaryman and the working man spend all their time working and little of their time solving complex problems using assets. This kind of problem solving is done by the businessman in return for profit. However, the businessman still relies on other people to turn assets into profit as well for his income. Profit generation is complicated by the presence of competitors, who tend to drive down returns and decrease profit margins. Decreased profit margins mean that the businessman has to use leverage or become much more competitive to keep making a profit. This leverage is obtained by using OPM to increase the size of the cycle, thus resulting in a tight coupling of the business cash flow. If something in the cycle fails, it doesn't take much to significantly impact the profit margin. The slack in this system is given by equity, which is the slack between assets and liabilities, or debt, in the cycle. The smaller the equity is relative to the assets and the earnings, the more vulnerable the business is to perturbations of the cycle, and the higher the returns or losses will be. Competition may therefore require the businessman to restructure his operations, diverting cash flows elsewhere as parts of the operation are creatively destroyed. While a lot of value can be destroyed, the broad industry knowledge survives to a large extent. For instance, with the introduction of new technology or the decline of rental income in certain neighborhoods, the structural knowledge of the businessman remains the same, as do most of the procedures of doing business. Only the assets are replaced. In a recession, the procedures of doing business may change. Some specialists, the assets, may be laid off, but the technology remains the same. Visualizing generalist knowledge as a wide bell curve, this situation would correspond to shifting the generalist curve a bit, which, unlike for the specialist's tall, narrow curve, still leaves substantial overlap with the market demand. The risk of the complex coupled businessman is thus not of losing his job, as it is for the specialist, because in principle the businessman doesn't have a job. and he'll always be able to work. His risk is in the loss of profit, as profit depends on customers buying his products. In that sense, companies owe their existence to consumers. Unlike the salaryman and the working man, the businessman doesn't risk losing his job, though he does risk losing his business. Like an exuberant artist or scientist, he is internally driven towards finding solutions, and he does not wait for employment to start working. The businessman is an entrepreneur. The risk for the businessman comes from the tight coupling between shareholders and bondholders on one side and consumers and workers on the other side, all of whom must be satisfied with the businessman in the middle, lest capital and profits vanish. Some companies reduce this risk by having no long-term debt, or by having special classes of shares. Others reduce it by having many customers or clients or easy access to labor, either by outsourcing, offering attractive benefits, or simply due to an abundance of workers in a given field. However, as long as there is a drive for profit, there will be competition and innovation, and those risks are hard to eliminate without monopoly pricing power, political favors, and other barriers to entry. Since profit is the income of the businessman, and since the businessman needs income to buy stuff for himself, he too is at risk. Many businessmen and entrepreneurs take steps similar to employees and establish emergency funds. However, those that desire to retire early either need to earn a lot of money fast or find an alternative solution. 3.1.4 The Renaissance Man. A Renaissance man is a person who is competent in a wide range of fields, covering intellectual areas as well as the arts, physical fitness, and social accomplishments. This contrasts with the more modern, specialized approach, where a person is encouraged to build skills in a single vocation and use the income from that to pay for everything else. However, I think it can be argued that a specialist is not a well-balanced human. Many people strive for a sense of balance between work and life without ever achieving it, leaving some areas underdeveloped and others overly so. This isn't the case for the Renaissance man, who develops all sides of himself to their full potential. Furthermore, generalized skills allow a Renaissance man to reach creative solutions for most of his needs. Because of his ability to solve problems, the Renaissance man is fairly independent of the marketplace, since he no longer has to buy nearly as much to satisfy his needs. Rather than buying a product, he puts solutions together, using social skills, like borrowing and bartering, technical skills, like building and re-engineering, artistic skills, like designing and creating, and physical fitness via human-powered tools. Buying less means that he doesn't require millions to reach financial independence. For the money he needs, jobs are much easier to find. The Renaissance man can apply for different jobs in different fields rather than just a single one. Although they don't pay as well as a highly specialized career job, less money is needed. Complex solutions based on multiple different skills don't require leverage. They may result in profit, but profit is merely a side effect of the construction, and therefore the Renaissance man isn't subject to the same risk as the businessman. The main purpose of the Renaissance man is to solve a problem as a human, rather than as part of the work-spend system. The Renaissance man is capable of many different things and doesn't restrict himself to vocational skills. He does his own taxes and researches his own investments. He can fix a computer or a broken appliance. He knows how to drive and fix a car, but he has enough time and athletic ability to ride his bicycle 20 miles instead, or run 5 miles to get groceries. Physically, he keeps up with people decades younger than himself. He can play an instrument, dance, paint, or write creatively. He can create interesting meals from scratch rather than recipe. Socially, he knows who to ask for help, who needs help, and how to put people together to efficiently solve problems. He is a leader or an inspiration to other people, whether it is personal, local, national, or global. The Renaissance man has the best of all worlds. Referring back to the domain of economic behavior, we can place the salaryman in the bottom right quadrant, linear and tightly coupled, the working man in the bottom left quadrant, linear and loosely coupled, the businessman in the top right quadrant, nonlinear and tightly coupled, and the Renaissance man in the top left quadrant, nonlinear and loosely coupled. Thus, we can draw a line of increasing job dependence from the highly independent Renaissance man to the highly dependent salaryman. with the working man and the businessman having a sort of semi-dependence. Similarly, we can draw a line of increasing asset independence from the highly independent working man to the highly dependent businessman. This can be thought of as an alternative 4 types or a further splitting into octants to more precisely describe the leanings of a person. In the latter case, each of the 4 types falls into a given wing. For example, a Renaissance man could be leaning towards asset-backed job independence of a businessman, or he could be leaning towards the jack-of-all-trades approach to job independence of a working man. Similarly, the salaryman could lean towards starting a side business or investing in stocks to provide more income to replace or add some of his job income, or he could reduce his need for job income by divesting some of the things he has financed and finding ways to do more and spend less. A working man with salaryman leanings could likewise engage in longer-term consulting projects. Independence is not something one has, rather it is something that one is. This is good news because it means that it is possible to change one's behavior and economic interactions in a way that fosters greater independence or less if so desired. The salaryman can work on reducing his dependence on money by learning and creating alternative solutions, thus reducing his dependence on a job. Such activities are best started through one's hobbies. Similarly, the working man can also learn to create solutions rather than buying them. In particular, it is quite likely that the working man will already be creating some of his own solutions, like car repair, lawn maintenance, plumbing, and so on. This could free up money for his legacy or charity, or the money could simply be used to buy time for early retirement. Finally, the businessman can discover other forms of profit than strictly monetary, like social and environmental. Health and good relations could just as easily be optimized, and when business size is subject to diminishing returns, why not aim for a smaller but more efficient business? That is, the business of finding solutions for just a handful of people, rather than leveraged solutions that control and serve thousands or millions of people. Doing this, the businessman will find that the leveraged bond eventually eases and money will flow to him freely. 3.2. Succession and the Cycle of Change. As mentioned in the previous section, different types dominate a culture during different periods. It's possible to model this change as an ecological succession of groups of 4 different agent species: Renaissance men, businessmen, salarymen, and working men, where each type feeds on the culture created by the previous type, but in turn sets up the next dominant type, which eventually will suppress and dominate it. In nature, succession is initiated by the formation of new, unoccupied habitat, for example, through lava flow, wildfires, or colonization. If soil is not present, the barren land is first populated by pioneer plants like moss and lichen that can live in cracks where water and dissolved minerals collect. These plants break down the rock into its mineral components and form soil when they decompose. The soil, whether already present or formed in the aforementioned process, is populated with annual weeds, which also die and contribute to the soil formation. Subsequently, perennial weeds, shrubs, and small trees like aspen or pine take over in competition for resources like sunlight. Larger trees like oak and elm subsequently block the sunlight for the shorter trees, which die out, and thus the habitat finally reaches what is known as a climax stage, or community, which is stable, barring any disruptions such as forest fires or lava flows, which restart the cycle. For an example of succession that is easier to relate to for a civilized person, consider how cookie-cutter housing developments easily populate undeveloped land, like weed seeds. These dwellings are unable to survive without cars forming long routes back to shopping centers in the city. As suburbia takes hold, strip malls appear closer to the development. These draw in more people, which increases the price of land and makes closer-spaced but higher-quality homes more economical. This in turn attracts small general shops, eventually forming a shopping street or downtown area. Sidewalks appear, followed by multi-story buildings in the city center. As the succession proceeds, old species like cars and sprawl are eliminated, eventually leading to the climax community of a city. The same thing occurs in the world of ideas. A group of people or a single person get a bright idea, which is completely different from all other ideas. If the idea has merit, other people pick up the idea and create their own personal variations on the idea. perhaps giving different names to the same object, or perhaps using different methods to arrive at the same conclusion. These people compete for dominance of their ideas, eventually reaching a point where only a handful of different methods are used. The next generation uses those methods to discover new details, but they don't compete on methodology, and hence it remains static. As the intellectual field matures, the rate at which details are discovered increases. As competition grows more intense, the scope of discovery narrows, specialization increases, and politics becomes increasingly more important, as happens in any complex society where resources, in this case the number of remaining discoveries to be made, are no longer abundant. The idea has reached its climax stage, a point where no new understanding occurs, just increasingly smaller adjustments of the details. Some observations. Each species is adapted to thrive in a very specific environment. If the conditions change, the existing species will be outcompeted by a species which is better adapted to the new conditions. Succession occurs because the dominance of one species gradually changes the environment. These are the most important observations. Keep in mind that one species may be dependent on other species or live together with other species in communities. A community is known as a seral stage. Seral stages merge gradually into each other until they reach the climax stage. The climax stage is stable, but may change due to external or internal disruptive events, such as lava flow or the invention of the steam engine. 3.2.1 Ergodicity and Destiny. It is possible to change species. Regardless of the initial state or large bumps along the way, people gravitate toward the outcomes their behavior induces. As species have different types of behavior, one must change behavior to change species. There's no faking it, nor is there any buying it. People do not change due to a single clever idea. They are what they are based on the totality of their behavior. In other words, luck is only important in the short term. In the long term, luck has little to do with success. For instance, a financially irresponsible person doesn't become a millionaire by winning $1 million. He merely becomes a financially irresponsible person with $1 million, and eventually the lucky money will be gone. A person becomes a millionaire by becoming the sort of person who deserves $1 million. He keeps it by being the sort of person that does not risk it. Or he loses it by engaging in risky business. In the latter case, he'll likely quickly reacquire the money by starting another business, though. The statement that people end up where they deserve does not imply any moral judgment, nor does it imply any form of entitlement. In particular, it's not meant in the modern marketing sense that people deserve anything they can imagine. Rather, it means that attitudes combined with actions lead to habits, which over time tend to deliver certain deserved outcomes. The mathematical term for this property, or statistical connection, is ergodicity. In popular psychology, it's known by various other names, such as positive thinking, synchronicity, and praying. These concepts are often described as magical thinking because the new habitual actions which result from mentally focusing on a goal and the statistical connection with the actual outcome go unseen. This doesn't mean these methods don't work, they do, but not for the reasons their believers promote. However, understanding that they work due to the aggregate effect of many small but congruent actions, and using this understanding methodically makes transitions more effective. As an aside, it's interesting to note that the popularity of these books and methods increase if they also make the untrue statement that you can have whatever you want merely by wishing for it to come true. This only holds during periods of prosperity, as a rising tide lifts all boats. It is therefore not surprising that such books sell mainly during economic boom times. Yet, while there is no physical connection between wishing for something and actually achieving it, there's no denying that by making something a priority and constantly thinking about it, you will influence your actions. There are two additional ingredients to this. First, you must pick the right actions. Second, your vision must lead to a mission. That is, actions must be initiated. To give an example of the wrong way to go about it, imagine that your dream is to become a millionaire. A very common dream, to be sure. The wrong way to dream about the $1 million is obviously thinking about what you're going to spend the money on once you have it. If you dream like that for too long, Soon you'll find yourself spending money you don't have yet, rationalizing that it's okay because you'll have it someday. Many student loans are spent along this line of thinking. The right way is to realize that in order to become a millionaire, you must earn at least $1 million more than you spend. Your every thought should therefore be about how you can A, earn more money, and B, spend less money. Since $1 million is a lot more than many people earn, the majority of your thoughts must revolve around how to earn more money rather than how to spend less. Conversely, my dream was financial independence, which means that investment income safely covers expenses. Hence, I spent most of my time thinking about how I could A, lower my expenses, and B, increase my investment income. Hence, I didn't have a particular net worth in mind, nor did I think particularly hard about ways to make more money. Agency. Humans with an internal locus of control, the belief that they're in control and that they're the masters of their own destiny, possess agency. Agency resists and reduces stress. Anyone who has been out in the world for a while and experienced a lot of different situations has a good idea of what is normal, and thus can describe a bad situation as what it is, simply a bad situation. Conversely, people with less agency and a belief that they are not in control of their destiny are more likely to be stressed and to suffer the associated health effects. Combined with self-confidence, agency is the attitude that any problem can be fixed, given enough resources in the form of time, effort, and determination. This attitude rests either on a thorough knowledge of or training in what is to be done, or on the surety that such knowledge or training can be attained. This attitude is often transferable from one field to another completely unrelated field. Doing something that is considered very difficult, at least once in your life, is highly recommended. 3.3. Our current world. I submit that we currently live in a climax stage. We have a political model that is based on leading in the popular polls, a model where barely differentiated political leaders pretend to be different by steering voters away from important issues and onto subjects that, albeit emotional, are of little consequence to most people. A model where the election is won by the person with the best marketing and where consistency and integrity are irrelevant. We have an economic model that is based on pulling resources out of the ground and mostly turning them into unnecessary products, getting people to buy the products by convincing them that they need them, then getting them to throw the products away because they're obsolete. This makes people buy the next model and bury the other one in the ground. The sole goal of this seemingly pointless exercise is to work faster and grow the gross domestic product, which measures the resource churn. We live in a world where the money necessary for our way of life comes out of a slit in the wall as long as we keep showing up for work. Yet only experts understand the fiat-based money credit system. We live in a world where food can be heated in a microwave oven at the touch of a button, yet only experts understand how this works. This goes for most of the other technology we use. All we know is that if we press this or that button, things magically happen. We are aware of large-scale problems, but most of us believe that we can't do anything about them. Instead, we believe in a mythical they who will find a solution, just like they have provided all this wonderful technology we surround ourselves with. We may be more technologically advanced as a group, and correctly but myopically hold up technology as our one indicator of progress. But in terms of individual understanding, we have not come far, and once again live according to old concepts. In fact, we might have turned a full cycle from the last climax stage, the Dark Ages. 3.3.1. Leaving the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was characterized by an old and mature society set in its ways. Ruled from the top down by kings and governed by religion, it was a world of superstition and magical thinking, where the individual had few options and all cultural trends pointed towards more of the same. If you substitute kings with national governments, religion with the myth of progress and economic growth, and superstition with the widespread belief in technological fixes supplied by a small group of people who are mostly unable to explain their knowledge to outsiders, you'll see that this world was perhaps more similar than dissimilar to the modern world. It was a world ripe for new ideas. The Dark Ages gradually ended 6 centuries ago with the Renaissance, which seeded new ideas for a different world. The Renaissance ideal dominated our culture until 3 centuries ago, from the 14th to the 18th century, when it was superseded by modernism. Not surprisingly, this human ideal has almost been forgotten in our culture. The Renaissance, literally rebirth, was a revival and rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman culture following the decline of culture, trade, and technology during the Dark Ages. Human achievement was once again put into the center of human focus. A Renaissance man strove to develop his capabilities to their fullest extent. As mentioned previously, the colonization of new habitats, whether physical land, as in the discovery of a new continent, physiological land, as in breaking the 4-minute mile barrier, or intellectual land, as in the discovery of new ideas, immediately initiates a succession. As soon as those idea seeds were sown, businessmen took unstructured but complex ideas and started commercializing them. Competitively, it's easier, but also riskier, to gain an advantage by leveraging complexity than it is to specialize while keeping the slack of the loose coupling, because the latter requires a lot of effort. Businessmen essentially moved the structure from skilled artisans to factories by setting up a structure. At this stage, businessmen focus their efforts on competing with other businesses until the structures for production are settled in large companies. For example, a handful of computer companies instead of the initial hundreds. And the industry is fairly stable. While businessmen may behave in a cutthroat fashion toward other companies, they're fairly honest with their employees. There's a need for loyal employees to fill the jobs. And at this stage, the beginning of industry and the formation of the big corporations we still see today, the businessmen, the salarymen, and the working men form a natural symbiosis. The culture moves from growth to steady state when consumption equals production. At this point, all the niches have been fully filled and intercompany competition has reached a state of consolidation and ceasefire. Now the salarymen are motivated by fear of losing their job and a need to keep paying their bills rather than the desire to work for the best company. The focus is thus on following the rules set down by the businessmen to regulate the business. However, the spirit of those regulations are still directed towards the competitiveness of the company. Eventually, some discovered that they can maximize their personal benefit not by supporting the company, but by supporting themselves. In other words, they become decoupled from the business. They start thinking about their number, their money in retirement accounts, broker accounts, or net worth, and they develop a fascination with tax deductions and gain impressive resume writing and interviewing skills. The entire system moves to finance, services, and politics, all intangibles. Having forgotten the historical background of their cultural setup, people adopt firm social beliefs that any problem can be solved in the social sphere as long as someone is given enough money to make it happen. Any connection with nature and most connections with technology are lost. There's a belief that nature is irrelevant and that anything can be solved using the current methods, now technology, previously magic or praying. We have finally arrived at a stage where people will sell their soul to build their resume, as long as they don't break the law, where people will work in polluting manufacturing plants while being against greenhouse emissions. This progression follows a clockwise cycle around the domain of economic behaviors, which describes the full development of a field. Each of the 4 types of people will be dominant at some point during this progression. 3.4. The next generation. When a new field is invented, it's not the salarymen, the businessmen, or the working men who dominate it. It's the inventors, the Renaissance men. A new field does not need to be commercial, nor does it need to sweep the world or usher in a new era. Whether it's raising goats or a family, starting an ecological community or an IT company, or preparing for the end of the world, the Renaissance man is the one who will get it done. For several generations, many people have been preoccupied with the mundane details of earning and buying as an end rather than a means. They spend their most productive hours and years in a job which they don't really care about, after which they go home exhausted to deal with spouse, kids, dinner, bills, trying to keep up with the neighbors, and languishing in front of the TV because they have little energy left. New generations have begun to question the wisdom of joining the scheme known as the rat race. Some have decided not to fight for a top spot in the corporate pyramid scheme, which in the previous stage was more akin to climbing the corporate ladder. Instead, they bypass the gatekeepers of traditional career paths and search for new venues to populate, so as to avoid the overcrowded traditional job market. The big question is, therefore, whether to play the games of modern consumer society or whether to start something different and, dare I say, more creative. We live in a consumer society where the focus is on service and finance due to a declining natural resource base. We also see the emerging problems of consumer society: stress, overwork, inflation, lack of balance, lack of paradigm-shifting innovation, stagnation, and loss of control, both on a personal level and occasionally a national scale. This indicates that the domain of economic behaviors is beginning to come to a full circle. It's not clear which direction the next cycle will take humanity: Brave New World, Information Revolution and the discovery of commercial fusion, or peak oil or water, irreversible climate crisis, and the decline and fall of civilization. Yet this will all be decided by those who live now, in part by you, and none will be more ideally prepared for a changing world, indeed, to change the world, than a Renaissance man.